Well, I'll get started and hope that she arrives by the time I'm finished. I understand that you've already been introduced to the 11 by 15 campaign. So that started in 2012 as an effort of the whole Wisdom Network around the state, of which the Racine Coalition is a member organization. But the work in efforts to seek treatment instead of incarceration began much earlier. We were involved back in 2004 at the time when the Racine County Jail expansion was proposed as a part of the Safer Coalition, which was an organization of a number of community organizations that felt that there were better options, both financially and in terms of addressing the needs of people who were getting caught up in jail and prison, that rather than expanding the size of the jail, we could find alternative programs. And it was at that time that I was introduced to our speaker. Diane Lang, who was serving on county board, took me and a few others up to the Benedict Center in Milwaukee. We met Kit McNally and we toured the Benedict Center and the Day Reporting Center, which was an initiative started through the Benedict Center. Kit McNally served as the director of the Benedict Center for 23 years. She's been a strong advocate for social justice in many of her activities, and especially through the Benedict Center. Like Rick, the Benedict Center is a nonprofit interfaith organization. They specifically focus on criminal justice, working with victims, offenders, and the community to achieve a system of justice that's fair. And one of the things that she emphasizes especially is treating each human being with dignity and respect. That's an underlying theme for all the work that the Benedict Center has done. The Benedict Center focuses specifically on the needs of women. But after recognizing through their work that many men were struggling with the same kinds of issues as they were getting caught up in conflict with the law, the Day Reporting Center was begun as an effort to provide opportunities for people to stay in the community and get treatment that they needed. So there's direct service efforts that are made for people who are struggling with issues related to the law. But the Benedict Center also advocates for changes in the criminal justice system, emphasizing restorative community alternatives to imprisonment. And so the fit with the 11 by 15 campaign that Rick has been working on since 2012 together with Wisdom is pretty clear. It's exciting to be back again and to hear from Kit again today. I encourage you to go to the benedictcenter.org website to learn more about the programs that are offered there. As I said, Kit served as director for 23 years. She retired from that position in 2011. But her advocacy work for justice has not ended. Her passion has not diminished. And so it is that she comes to be with us tonight. I invite you to please welcome Kit Murphy McNally.
Although I don't know if I'd be I probably am loud enough without it. Well, thank you. I'm really very pleased to be invited to be here, and very pleased that you guys are doing what you're doing here in Racine. I want to talk about what's going on, what has gone on, and what I think is going to be going on in criminal justice in Wisconsin. And because I know there was some interest in the Minnesota-Wisconsin, it's not looked at as a parallel, but it really is. I mean, it's amazing how alike we are. We should have all been one state. We'd have a lot more clout in this country. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a little short story, and I want to tell you a little short story at the end, because I consider myself kind of a junkie for justice. And I think these little stories kind of help illustrate why I feel that strongly that we need to do something to change the criminal justice system in the state. Years ago, the Benedict Center did a tutoring program in the Milwaukee County Jail. There were 10 men who came every day for 6 weeks and sat in a little mustard painted colored walls. The walls were painted this awful mustard yellow. The windows were painted black, little beat up table, and they'd all sit around there with our tutor. Well, there was one individual in this group named Racine. He's a big guy, street scarred. He would come every single day. He'd do his homework every single night, and he even illustrated it before he brought it back. But when he was there, he'd just sit there with his arms folded and scowling, looking down at the table, never said a word. Well, after the 6 weeks, at that time we were allowed to take in cookies and punch for the graduation, and everybody got a certificate. Well, Rafi hadn't really, I don't know that he gained that much out of the tutoring, but he had really tried. And so he got a certificate for completion that said, perfect attendance, and a gold star for all of the illustration, the extra work you put into it, and a silver star because you tried so hard. Well, the certificate was handed to Rafi, and he got down, he looked down, and with his finger, he was tracing along the words. And he got done, and everybody was watching him because normally he did nothing. He got done, and real slowly he lifted his head, and he had this great smile on his face, and he picked up the certificate, and he says, "This is the first time in my life anybody ever said I'd done good." And this was like 20 years ago, and I still remember this man. And my thought at the time, and my thought still, is how in the world can we as a community allow a child to grow up and never hear those words until he or she is incarcerated in the county jail? And that's just beyond comprehension to me. But I'm going to talk on a bigger level about some of this now, which all comes back to the reason for it are young men like Rafi and young women and older men who are caught up in the system, and so many have mental health issues, they're people of color, their ethnicity is not mainstream, and poverty permeates everything. But as far as the similarities or the differences in Minnesota and Milwaukee, or I keep saying that, Milwaukee is such a problem, it comes in my head before Wisconsin. Minnesota and Wisconsin are what I will call a tale of two states. And after we look at Minnesota, I want to talk a little bit about Wisconsin and what's happened to us since the 1970s. We were really good in the 1970s. Fell pretty solidly from grace in the interim years. And then, I guess at the end, I sort of look at it as reclaiming justice. What's going on now in the state that's, I think, going to make a huge difference in how we do justice in Wisconsin in the years to come. So what about Minnesota? our people and theirs came from pretty much the same place. We came from the same parts of Europe. We started territories when we got here to the Middle West. And within 10 years of one another, we each became states. Wisconsin the first in 1848. As I say, we should have just stuck together and been one state. I think we would have gotten some good influences from next door. But I think what you do know is their prison population, or our prison population, is 2.5 times their prison population. So clearly we're doing something that they're not, or they're doing something that we're not. And I think in context, when you look at Wisconsin, we're really not all that bad. We're pretty much right in the middle. The federal government ranks states according to their prison population per 100,000 people. Wisconsin ranks 29. Now, the number 1 is the worst, and number 50 is the best. So we're 29th, kind of in the middle. Our neighbor across Lake Michigan, is number 14. Worse than us. On the lower side, though, we've got Illinois, which ranks 33rd, Iowa is 40, and Minnesota holds the spot that we held in the 1970s, which is 49. Only Maine incarcerates at a higher rate than Minnesota. Well, when you look at crime rates, Minnesota and Wisconsin are really extremely close. They have about 3,000 violent property crimes per 100,000 people. We have 31,000. So this doesn't explain why we lock so many more people up. The sorry statistic is getting a lot of press of late, and you probably know what the sorry statistic is. Turn it into a tongue twister. The fact that we rank number 1 in the incarceration of African American men. It sort of blows your mind to think that we are doing this in Wisconsin. Illinois isn't doing it. People look at Chicago as the big Milwaukee, but we're doing it. And the sad thing is, I mean, there's really nothing that's not sad about that, but we knew this 14 years ago. At the turn of the century, Wisconsin stood out as having the highest disparate rate of incarceration of African Americans. Now, if you got the highest rate, what's going to happen? You're going to wind up with the highest number. So we knew it. We knew it for all these years, and we did nothing about it. It's just continued to be a bad problem. Looking at a snapshot of Minnesota and Wisconsin as far as the population and where they are and what they're doing and where they came from, there's a lot of similarities. Minnesota has a total population of 5.7 million people. Wisconsin, 5.4 million. Of their population, 87% are white. Wisconsin, 83% are white. The African Americans in Minnesota, 5.4%, and Wisconsin, 6.3%. I believe that 6.3% represents some Latinos who are black but don't identify as Latino, which mixes up these numbers in both states. Because our Latino count is very low. It's 2.9%. For Minnesota, it's 3%. Those are all but identical population numbers between the two states. 70% of the Minnesotans are of German and Nordic heritage combined. 71% in Wisconsin are German, Irish, Polish, and Norwegian in that countdown. I was surprised about the Irish. I didn't know we were that populous here. As far as faith, the majority in Minnesota are Protestant, primarily Lutheran, and Catholics, Roman Catholics are second. In Wisconsin, we're primarily Catholic with a healthy representation of Protestants of various faiths, number 2. Minnesota has essentially has one major urban area, which is the Twin Cities. Interestingly, the population there is primarily white, and minorities have moved out to surrounding areas, which is kind of unusual for urban areas. In Wisconsin, obviously, as you know, we have more urban areas scattered around the state with Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Green Bay, La Crosse, Eau Claire, and Madison. But the population in all of those places accounts for 46%. No, I got the wrong number. That accounts for 68% of our state. And 31% of the urban population is represented from right here in Racine and Milwaukee together. So you see in both of these states, most of the population living in urban areas. In Milwaukee, largely African American, 45% of the state prison system is coming from Milwaukee, which is a majority minority city now. This involves the whole state. Sorry for having to keep looking at all these numbers, but I can't hold numbers in my head except the really bad ones. 1 in 8 black men are in prison in Wisconsin now. In Milwaukee, half of all the black men in Milwaukee have been incarcerated at one point or another. And also, the black population within the city of Milwaukee all live within the 6 highest levels of zip codes with the 6 highest levels of poverty. We know these correlations, and we've been watching them get worse and worse and not doing anything about them. I already mentioned the majority in the urban areas of Minnesota are white. Minnesota is a strongly blue state. Wisconsin is becoming a toss-up. We do have, though, a very progressive history. Back in the 70s, Wisconsin and Oregon were the 2 states everyone looked to for progressive prison and criminal justice reform and mental health reform. We emptied all of our mental health hospitals. We did nothing to plan for where the people were going, and so then we wound up flipping them right back into our prisons, and have spent a lot of time since then figuring out how to get them out of the prison and get these people the help that they really need, that they lost all along the way. So we have that progressive background there. We also have the distinction of being the birthplace of the Republican Party in Ripon. And we have our Senator Joe McCarthy that we followed along on his witch hunt. At the same time well, it wasn't exactly the same time, but later on, when Minnesota put their anti-war Gene McCarthy up for president. A little bit of difference there. But does it do any of these differences really explain why we incarcerate so many more people than Minnesota? Some of it may have some bearing, some of it may not, and I don't think anybody has really been able to nail it down to why are we behaving differently in Wisconsin than they behave in Minnesota. But the key difference that I think has accounted for what has happened in Minnesota over the years that hasn't happened here is they have a Community Corrections Act. They established this in the 70s, before the war on drugs was declared, before a lot of rhetoric started, people thinking, oh my God, everybody's dangerous, we got to get them off to jail or prison. Community Corrections Acts focus on resources going into the community and trying to keep people out of the prison system. It's essentially came about as a financial tool to keep the cost of criminal justice down. But a lot of good people used it to do good things, to create alternatives in the community. And some states like Oregon actually would monitor how much money they were saving by people not going into the prison system and send that money back out into the community for good programming. Wisconsin did not create a Community Corrections Act. And when I tried to find out from folks who were politically involved back in the 1970s, early 1970s, why not? They said they had no idea, but it was probably because we were doing things so well then, everyone thought we didn't need one. Today, 21 states have Community Corrections Act, and most of those states have a much better handle on who's in their prison system, who's in their jails, and who's in the community getting treatment and support. And the one thing that is true of Minnesota is they have a lot more people in their jails than we do in Wisconsin. But the people in the jails are there for a much shorter period of time, they're close to their families, and they're connected directly to programming they got in the jail when they get back out into the neighborhood. So it makes a big difference when you're doing local incarceration that way versus sending people away to prison. Another difference in that line in Minnesota is they have a sentencing commission. They were in fact the first in the country to create a commission to get a handle on indeterminate sentences, which were used, really they were used by judges to make whatever they wanted the sentence to be. There was no guidelines, and if they thought you looked like you needed to be in prison for 10 years, that's what you got. If you look like a nice, sweet little person, maybe you'd get 10 months probation. So it was very erratic when indeterminate sentences were used. Sentencing commissions aren't perfect, and they have their problems, but they don't have problems like they had in Wisconsin. We created one and then got rid of it. Then we created another one and we got rid of it. And the reason we got rid of it was because the sentencing commissioners started doing a lot of research. And they found that we could be doing justice much differently in this state. And they tried to get these reports into the hands of legislators, and they tried to get legislation put forward that had to do with the recommendations made in their report. Never would a legislature bring these issues forward. It got so bad that with the second round of the Sentencing Commission, and they really did good stuff. I knew some of the commissioners in both of the commissions. I read their reports. They were outstanding. I used them when I was talking about advocacy and what we needed to do. I was amazed that not a single legislator would do anything with them. But the situation was so bad that the head of the Sentencing Commission went back to Oklahoma, where it was much more progressive than in Wisconsin. These things really give you pause. Truly, Oklahoma? The only states that are worse than Michigan as far as the number they incarcerate are the southern states and Oklahoma. But somehow they were more willing to listen than Wisconsin. So that's kind of what's going on in Minnesota, what's going on in Wisconsin. I don't think it totally explains why they have so many fewer people in prison. Although I will tell you, the prison population is growing right now in Minnesota. And the reason is they have a terrible meth problem, and there's very little treatment can do for meth. It really gets everyone up against the wall with how we're going to respond to this. And the other thing that's filling up their prison beds is a very stiff drunk driving law. Obviously, we don't have that kind of drunk driving laws here at this point. So that's kind of where the Wisconsin-Minnesota dichotomy stands. But then to take a look at Wisconsin, what's our story? What happened? Because we started out so good. We really were a leader. We were so much of a leader that today when people from the East Coast and the West Coast come through the state and they're meeting with us on issues, they say, oh, we really wanted to come. You guys do such great work here. And then they're just amazed to find out what we've done with our justice system. I think a lot of us that are here that have been involved in the justice system we're amazed what we've done with our justice system too. But we're going to get it undone. We are. The pendulum keeps swinging, and it's gone so far one way, it's our turn to do the things that need to be done and to do them right. Back in the 70s, there were only 3,000 people in our prison system. 3,000. And even when I started working at the Benedict Center in 1988, there were only 7,000 people in the prison system. Today there's 22,000. At one time we were pushing 24,000. Why? Minnesota has 9,000. The advocates, both in Milwaukee and Madison, were trying pretty much from the late 70s on to this day to get the legislature to pass the Community Corrections Act here so there would be some standing to turn around, begin to turn around what we're doing with imprisonment and with community programming. There has never been a legislator willing to carry this forward, except Becky Young, who tried very hard to make it an issue in the legislature and did not succeed. She was so involved in good programming for alternatives and rational justice that when she died, the state created a fund, a Becky Young fund, that was intended to fund community programs, but they handed it over to the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections, 2/3 of their budget goes to prisons and 1/3 goes to the community. And the 1/3 that goes to the community goes to some pretty stiff kinds of programs, pretty stiff corrections. In fact, the probation, and there's really no parole. In fact, that's another issue. There is no parole now. There are people in prison who should be paroled. They're sitting there. They should have been out some time ago, and there's no parole commission. And no one is worried about the fact that it's not legal. I mean, it's a suit. It's clearly a lawsuit that's coming, but why should we have to file a lawsuit to get a little bit of justice done for anything? That's on the side, which I'm trying to stick to notes here so that I don't do that, because I do tend to divert very easily. The Becky Young Fund has not really made it into the community to fund progressive programs. And I'm sure Becky would be very unhappy if she knew how this had fizzled out. But then she would probably understand it totally, because all of the initiatives, many that I worked with her on, really never made it anywhere either. What built up the prison populations everywhere after the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson started crashed and burned, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, and that was followed by a war on crime, and that was followed by a war on youthful predators. And if anything the media ever picked up was wrong and got in the households and the common conversation everywhere, it was this business of youthful predators. Young men between the ages of 14 and 26 are the #1 leading risk of crime. It's just something that comes with being male. But they're not predators. Very few of these folks are predators. And what a scary word. The media they were guilty for picking up this language. They were guilty for furthering the war on drugs. It's snappy stuff to talk about on the radio. It works good in headlines. And it does such great damage to our neighbors and our sons and our daughters and fathers and mothers. And so these bad laws, irrational thinking, irresponsible reporting, and really snarky commentary from the opinion leaders did a lot to convince the country they were in great danger. Crime was just rampant, and drug-crazed people were going to threaten their very existence, when in fact the violent crime rate has really been very steady, and crime rate's been falling since the early 90s. You wouldn't know that from the media. It sounds like it's just all really taken off, but it's not. It's just the way people are able to tell the story, and they don't tell it true. Well, as our prison population expanded across the country, there were law enforcement dollars just literally pouring into states. In Milwaukee, this was very lucrative. We wound up with more police per capita than in any other city in the country. And you know what you have when we got more police? They're on the streets, and they're on the streets in very vulnerable communities. And when there's street drugs going on, it's street drugs they're going to find, and they're going to find the people with them, whether they're using or whether they're dealing. And they're going to go to jail, and then they're going to go to prison, and then they're going to fill up your prisons. It's that combined with really bad legislation. Any legislation that's got a name of a human being is terrible legislation. It means it was passed in an emotional time. It means it was not well thought through, and it means it's going to cause great harm in the end. An example of this is the three strikes law in California. The abduction and murder of Polly Claus was really what promoted that. And California subsequently has overfilled its prisons with low-level offenders who are in there for life. Consequently, after they had bankrupted, nearly bankrupted the state, really destroyed a public education system, higher education system that was the envy of everyone in the country. They're now having to let people out of prison, and it's not this thoughtful, careful letting out. It's we've got to shut them down because we cannot afford to keep these prisons open. It's unconscionable. It never should be allowed to happen, but it happens every day. Every day there's some new case, and people go to the legislature and say, we need Polly's law, we need Sandy's law, we need Johnny's law. Bad law. Really, really bad law. Well, states, in our state, what this all caused, of course, was prison building and prison expansion. It was very expensive. And Governor Thompson, after he had built the Supermax out in Boscobel that we did not need, we do not have a lot of these really, really uncontrollable, violent inmates in our prison system. And ironically, the few that we did have, we sent across the river to Stillwater, Minnesota, who had a control unit prison, and we rented a few beds, and they were fine. But a lot of money came into the state from the federal government in return for building a Supermax. So we built it, and have spent most of the time since we built it figuring out how to use it. And there's really, the way to use it is to blow it up. But it was enough that Thompson, after that happened, said no more. Not going to build any more prisons. And he asked Walter Dickey, who's outstanding law professor at the University of Wisconsin, and who was for a while the Secretary of the Department of Corrections, to head up a task force to look at sentencing and corrections in Wisconsin. The task force came up with a great plan. It was really excellent. I know Walter well, and he put together this task force with conservatives and business leaders. And when he did it, I said, oh my God, why are you doing that? Those aren't the people that want to get people out. Those aren't the people that want to create a lot of alternatives in the community. And he says, that's exactly why I'm doing it. He says, we're going to go around the state. We're going to listen to people. We're going to hear the stories. We're going to hear from people directly what this imprisonment, what all the prison, the prison building has done to the people in this state, the families in this state. And I can guarantee you they're going to want to do something different when we're done. And they did. The plan they came up with was to create, well, it wasn't even as specific as creating regional facilities. It was letting each region decide what they would like to do with people who offend that weren't, terribly violent and dangerous. There would still be prisons to send those people off to, but very few of them. But in a region, you could decide what you wanted. Maybe you wanted a reporting center and not have anything that required people to be locked up. Depending on what kind of problems you had and how you felt about dealing with these issues in your community. Or you could create a regional facility, and this he particularly was talking about as a maybe in the southeastern part of Wisconsin. You'd want a regional facility that was close to where people live. They would be incarcerated for a short time in this facility and get training and education and treatment. But very quickly they would move out into the community and be connected with community programs and their family and get a lot of support from agents that were working in the community, not to watch them and not to be saying, oh, did you get home late last night? Or did you check into that place that you're not supposed to go? Or they wouldn't be doing that. They'd be doing positive things. How are you doing making a connection on a job? What are you looking for? What can I do to help you? Which he had even mapped out how much more economical it was going to be to pay 10 of these people to stand on a street corner and work with the people that had been arrested from that corner than it would be to send them to prison where the next 10 kids would be on the street corner doing the same thing. But by having someone in the community doing positive things, you kept that street corner clear and helped the kids that were ready to stand into the middle of the mess. It was a really a great idea, and it was very well laid out in the report that the mayor of Milwaukee had not even read when he called a press conference the next morning after it was released. And he told the media, I will absolutely have no bed and breakfast prisons in Milwaukee. Well, this is, magic words, fun stuff to do. Everybody ran off to talk about how the state wanted to put bed and breakfast prisons in Milwaukee. We're going to coddle these people and they'll just go in and out and have a nice place to sleep at night. There was no truth to what was reported about it. There couldn't have been, because they talked to the mayor and the mayor hadn't read it. But the whole reason this press conference occurred was political. Thompson was going to run for governor again, and the mayor and the attorney general were considering running. So to get the political edge, the mayor had this press conference. This was Mayor Norquist, not the current mayor. Just bad all the way through, to take such advantage of something that you don't even know about as a political tool when something could have happened that really would have stopped prison expansion. We haven't built new prisons, but we have greatly expanded the ones we've got. When a private prison industry came into Wisconsin, they built a prison in red granite. The legislators claimed, we didn't know they were doing that. We didn't hear anything about it. They didn't check with us first, because private prisons are illegal in Wisconsin. Illegal. We have to keep our prisoners, as long as they're in the state, we have to keep them in public prisons. But this private prison was built completely, and the state, to their credit, the legislature still said, no, we're not going to bring in private okay, nobody private's going to run this prison. But yes, what did happen though that we all paid for was the building was built and there had to be a minimal staff there to manage it so that it didn't deteriorate. So for several years we paid people just to be in an empty prison. Well, of course, ultimately the state bought the prison and filled it up. But still, we have hung tight on not having private prisons in the state of Wisconsin. However, because we weren't building new prisons, and because the population was growing, we wound up sending a lot of our inmates out of state to Tennessee and Oklahoma, West Virginia, where they were in private prisons. Now, the Department of Corrections says we're monitoring, we're sending people out, we're checking on them, we're making sure things are all right. But they didn't get out there very often. And nobody liked it. And no one was happy we were doing this because we truly did not know what was going on. The private prison industry is really sort of a scary monster. Community Corrections of America, which runs all the prisons in Tennessee, and we speculated on what happens if they go bankrupt and belly up suddenly. What's Tennessee going to do with all these prisons that they no longer have any management role in? But one of the things that CCA did in prison, their main prison, was every day on the gate to the prison they would post their stock standing. Now, does this say anything at all about what was most important to this corporation? It certainly wasn't the men and women behind the fence. I'm trying to think of a kind way to talk about the worst thing I think we've done that has, aside from rolling along with the war on drugs and locking up far too many people, especially far too many people of color because they were easy to find and to prosecute and to imprison, was passing the worst truth in sentencing law in the nation. And it is absolutely the worst. We were the only state to pass a truth in sentencing law that said the individual had to serve 100% of their sentence. Most of them were 75, 85%. Ours was 100%, and it's a bifurcated sentence, so part of it is served incarcerated and the other part on extended supervision. Extended supervision had to be at least 25% of the incarcerated portion, but it could be more. What the judges, well, they also thought, they added six new felonies. So it was very, much more clear who's going to get charged with a felony and go off to prison. But they, excuse me, I lost my track of thought on what they were doing. Six new felonies and the truth in sentencing and the bifurcated sentence. This was the horror that went totally out of my head. Extended supervision has been, instead of being 25% most commonly of the incarcerated sentence, it's been much longer. The feeling was when they reworked the sentencing guidelines, the judges would actually sentence people for what this 100% was going to be because they knew they would be there. Before that, people generally would serve about 50 to 60% of their sentence before they'd be eligible for parole unless they really were not at all compliant when they were imprisoned. And judges tend to give longer sentences knowing that they would be out probably halfway through the sentence. With truth in sentencing, they knew they wouldn't be out partway through, but they still gave longer sentences. So this has also compounded the situation of who we have in prison and how long we have them in prison. But the true horror there's two true horrors of extended supervision. One is you can violate on the last day of your extended supervision and go back to prison and have to serve the whole sentence over. The incarcerated sentence and the extended supervision. It is theoretically possible for someone with a very minor offense to wind up with a life sentence. And this is true because 70% of our prison admissions are violations of extended supervision. They're violations without new offenses. Now, when you're for years under supervision and you've got somebody watching everything you do and you've got 40 rules that you're expected to comply with, it's not that hard to start doing things that violate those rules. So it's not that hard to wind up back in prison, particularly if you can't find work because you have a criminal record, you don't have a family that's strong and structured and ready to bring you in and support you. You didn't get adequate treatment. To get treatment in the state prison system, you have to apply for it and get it before you can be released. And you have to do it the last 6 months of your prison sentence. And that means you have to start asking really early because not very many of the prisons have treatment. You have to get transferred from wherever you are to where the treatment program is. Nuts. It's just nuts. But while these things have been going on, most of them, pretty terrible things, but none of them quite as bad as truth in sentencing. There have been some really good things trying to mitigate what happened, some things that haven't worked necessarily, but a lot of good effort went into them. Walter Dickey's commission was one, that task force that went on the shelf. But there's also a planning and policy committee, which is really a stellar committee of the Supreme Court. And alternatives to incarceration are one of the key things they look at. They've heard a lot of testimony, they've had some good plans, but nothing, really nothing concrete has come from that. Coming from the Supreme Court, it would have a lot of clout behind it. They really have the power to do something if they decide they want to push one of these initiatives. Governor Doyle's Commission on Reducing Racial Disparities in the Wisconsin Justice System had all the right people on it, had a great report. In a couple places, I don't know if anything of that report is happening in Wisconsin or in Racine, but there isn't anything happening in Milwaukee. Why would we need to reduce disparities in Milwaukee? I do think out along the western edge of the state, some of those, La Crosse and Eau Claire, are doing some things with recommendations from the commission, but it's certainly not getting the mileage it should have gotten. It dealt with really serious issues, had a lot of good people testifying, had an excellent report and recommendations, and there it sits on the shelf. Special legislative count. There was a legislative council special committee on justice reinvestment that the Center for State Courts supported in Wisconsin. Legislature met for about 6 months and got great data. The Pew Center for Courts was also involved in this, and for the first time there was data pulled out of the Department of Corrections that really gave a clear picture of what was going on. And that's where we found out that 70% of the people going into our prison system were violators of extended supervision and not having new offenses. The state had always maintained, oh, well, you know, that's a bad statistic because they've reoffended, but they hadn't. There were 5 pieces of legislation that came out of that commission, and it was bipartisan, some very, very vocal conservatives on it. Thank you. And Lena Taylor was the chair, and so no nonsense, you know, we're going to get this done. Everyone unanimously came together around these 5 recommendations, which would have really circumvented truth in sentencing and helped a lot of people get out of prison when they deserved to get out of prison. Got to the legislature, was passed by the legislature, got to Governor Doyle, and was vetoed. It was vetoed because the Secretary of the Department of Corrections said, we have an early release program, an earned release program, that's almost ready to launch. It's going to do all those things that you've got in that legislation, but it's going to do it better. Well, it was probably another 2 years before the earned release program even made it public. And when it did, DOC made a number of mistakes. They, first of all, called it early release. And right away the media grabbed on this. Early release, they're releasing all of these crazed killers to the street early. What are we going to do? We can't let this happen. As far as the inmates were concerned, they didn't just have an early release program, earned release program, they had 3. And the inmates had to find the right one the first time they applied, because if they applied and that wasn't one that applied to them, they couldn't apply to either of the other 2. It was so convoluted that the few people who did get out on earned release got out a few weeks or a few days before their sentence actually would have been up. And some got so caught up in the bureaucracy and the red tape, they actually got out after their sentence ended. Well, it didn't matter a whole lot because in less than 2 years the program died. And it died because of all the publicity about early release, and Wisconsin is letting prisoners out right and left, and we got to stop this. And so the OC stopped it. I think that's really what I've gone through. Is not everything that's gone wrong. There's been a whole lot of things that have gone wrong. There have been even more attempts to do things right. But a lot of it has been studies and commissions and recommendations. And if we have learned nothing, it's that people don't read these reports, they don't act on these reports, and these reports don't sway the policymakers. What does is people. It's you and I, it's stories. You got to have the data, and there's plenty of people putting data together. There's plenty of data already out there. But a representative who has a real live person sitting in front of him making a case reacts much more to the issue than all of the paper that you could pile on him in a year. And that's where Wisdom has been doing such a fantastic job. Wisdom and Micah from Milwaukee, and is it Rachel?
Racine Interfaith Coalition from Racine.
Okay, yeah. So you guys, most of you probably know about the power of all of that, and the 11 by 15 initiative is, by 15 we're not going to have the prison down to half. But what we do have is gold. It's legislators knowing constituents, having a real face in their minds and a real person and persons when they start looking at the data. And I believe, I just really do believe this is one of the really bright things coming up for our justice system, that we can make a change and it'll be people making a change.
De todos los días la que zumba, subiendo y bajando como la historia. Llegamos con la memoria de Antillana, la brisa de resistencia, la confederacia de los de Quimbamba. Saludos, raza, raza de la casa de Guni, abuelito Silvano, el hermano de los brujos de Guayama, el pana de los macheteros, esperando la fiambrela de sus hijos, caminando descalzo y desmayado, caminando de lado, comiendo pegado y leyendo Mao.
It started in the streets. It started in the streets, not in institutions, not in institutions. To write a constitution, who wrote any constitution that stagnated waves of revolution and complete eternal change? Who wrote this constitution? And do we know the meaning of the constitution, my brother? What does a constitution constitute to you? To me, black man wasn't written for them or the brother who was made to rule the other. It started in the streets. It started in the streets, not in institutions, not in institutions, not in the hospitals, bug houses, and beat-up squads, where heavy shadows of death hang over a prison yard. Attica, yes, I took her, my black queen, from a stereotype of the educational system that impounded vile perversions of Western civilization or her beautiful black mind. Damn an institution, yeah, this shit is real sweet when it starts in the street. It's some kind of deep education and a revolution of this unrighteous constitution and of their institutions and by their institutions. Niggas, jigaboos, goons, junkies, flunkies, and even some liberal honkies. It really started in the street. It started in the street. My people did not know. My people didn't know why they were being beat with chains and gloves and police feet. Niggas, is revolution, and it started in the street. It started in the streets.
Who I be, who you be, who we be I, singular I. Now the essence of lo africano y that of lo indio, one within me. So when you call me Spanish, all my purity seems to vanish, cause that is not who I be. So don't refer to me with words that blur the trueness to my identity, defining me by a colonizer's language, disregarding my family lineage, my ancestral heritage. Now I be the rhythm of the conga, played to an internal bomba, extending from Nigeria from a culture called Yoruba. I be the misplaced koki, snatched away from my existence tree, many identify to have died, but somehow have survived. I'll be the sugar cane and coffee of a land which was once cultivated to grow plenty. I'll be earth, wind, fire, and water in no particular order, road to one. And I'll be Guasabara, attack, Boricua attack, still dodging a dog and ducking a gun. And I'll be earth music, protest music like hip-hop, be blend out in syncopation with the sun. So don't misdefine me, insult me, disrespect me, intentionally or unintentionally, reshaping my nationality, raping the humanity within me, romanticizing a brutal history, confusing our offspring, cutting off their wings so they can't fly high and rely